He said, Howard, simultaneously presided over an economic mess. Business interest rates reached 21%, but to no avail in terms of economic governance. That's the point. Not the level, but to no avail in terms of economic governance. In 1981, wages grew by 16%, leading to a recession marked by a combination of stagnant growth and high inflation. By the time Howard had handed over the economy to Labor in 1983, the economy was growing at only 1.4%. The unemployment rate was 11% and inflation had reached 11%. Paul Keating's comments in later years was fair enough. We went into Howard's recession with double-digit inflation and we came out with double-digit inflation. Whereas from my time, in the so-called recession we had to have, we went into it with inflation at about 7% and we came out with inflation at 1%. As a consequence, we had the decade of the 1990s and beyond with continuous low inflationary growth. Now, all of that's completely true. The guy that missed the great opportunity in those years, the phrase he used, was of course Howard. But he got out of it. And then because of the Howard Peacock succession, and it went on and on and on, finally, after the collapse of Downer, he becomes opposition leader and then picks up the new-made economy, free, gratis and for nothing. But any society with any self-regard would have drummed him out of public life after the 1980s, his early 1980s performance. This guy tried his wages experiment on in 1981 and gave us 16% wages growth and 11% inflation. The very same thing he tried on this time, except this time with his wages system. It was built on my wages system, enterprise bargaining and the safety net after I moved out of centralised wage fixing, you know. And that's why his movement with work choices, of course the Tories wrote it up as taking the inevitable change Keating began. Keating didn't begin the wages change, Keating started it, went through it and finished it. Complete. We didn't need work choices. Work choices is just a nasty, bitchy piece of legislation to knock off the income of the low paid. But when he tried it with centralised wage fixing in 1981, of course, he was like the boy in the powder keg, you know. He's in there, there's all the TNT around him, he lights up the match, where am I? Boom! We soon worked out where he was. But it's worth recording, as David does here, just how much he got away with. Then he talks about the role of the float in beating the hedge funds off in 97, 98. You remember all the pruning Peter Costello did about, we came through the crisis in 97, 98. Really mean the mere fact that I'm there as Treasurer meant that all those nasty hedge funds all took fright and ran away. Well, what happened was, of course, with the float, the central bank was no longer there to be played against, as it was in other periods. And when you had these runs by hedge funds or money market funds against a country, as you saw, you know, with George Soros and the English pound, you had it when you had a system of managed valuations. When I floated the exchange rate, I removed all exchange controls, so the exchange rate was truly floating. It was a quantity-based system. The price of the money, the price of the exchange rate was set by the quantity of buying versus the quantity of selling versus the potential of the quantity of buying. It was no longer a price-based system. And so therefore, if hedge funds wanted to speculate, they weren't speculating against the central bank, they were speculating against other private people. And then David correctly talks about the depths of the Australian foreign forex market, foreign investment market. And he mentions as a prop in this book Macquarie Bank as an example of an outfit which grew out of the financial freedoms that had been introduced during my years and the depths of the Australian foreign exchange market. And that market's depth meant that when the hedge funds took us on, after they'd flattened Thailand, flattened Indonesia and flattened Korea, they ran into trouble here and went away with their tails between their legs, because in the end they didn't know whether they would have to cover their short positions at a higher exchange rate. So, of course, you know, the pruning went on, and of course in those days nobody in the Labor Party in 97 or 8 would stand up for the structural changes which I and Bob Hawke and our colleagues had introduced. So as a consequence, Costello got away with this argument, oh, we were able to take the economy, as if that nong was able to take the economy anywhere, let alone through a crisis of this kind, without the structural, the flexibility in the economy helping him. The floating exchange rate protection of the 1990s worked so well because despite the sustained sneers of the Howard government through its long term of office, Paul Keating left John Howard with a domestic economy that for a time was pretty much a model of rectitude. Productivity was sustained at a high enough rate to keep domestic inflation very low in the face of strong rising demand. Prices did not rise unduly, yet profit margins kept investment rising at a pace that steadily lifted employment and tax revenues to remarkable levels. Spurred on by the new forms of saving available to ordinary workers, the domestic savings rate continued to rise. This was a dream setting for a falling exchange rate because it meant that the internal effects of a fall in the currencies were benign. And that is true. Unfortunately, my colleagues in the party gave that up to Howard and Costello, and they made hay while the sun shone, taking that enormous bequest and sticking it in their pocket. But he goes on to say, he says, the coalitions, he says, when they broke their commitment to pay the extra 6% on superannuation to take it to 15%, he says the government broke economic discipline. It'll turn out that the coalition's greatest crime was to allow the private sector deficit to steadily increase under the mask of Commonwealth budget deficits. And this is the thimble and pea trick which Costello ran for years. That is, we've paid off Labor's debt, but what they first talked about as Labor's debt was a debt truck with 190 billion written on the side of it. That was our external debt abroad. It was not the Commonwealth's budget debt. But when he got to office, Costello, he realised it was a much harder thing to do to restrain the government, the private debt abroad than it was to cut the government debt. So he started then letting the budget, of course, naturally pay itself off as the recovery came through the 90s and tax revenues picked up. And he said, we paid off Labor's debt. In fact, what's happened, the debt went from 200 to 600 billion and is over now 650 billion. And David extrapolates the point that now, would we be sloshing around in these polluted debt markets if we didn't have to borrow the 600 billion and add to it 7% of GDP on the current account every year? In other words, if we'd have taken superannuation from 9 to 15%, the improvement in savings on the current account was worth a further 3% of GDP. So instead of running a current account deficit of around 6% of GDP now, we'd be running at around 3%. In other words, let me make it simple, our banks would not be out there borrowing in New York at rates of interest which reflect the risks in the American financial system to fund the current account deficit because of a paucity of savings here at a time when they're borrowing maturities to under 12 months. Now, quotes here an American, I gave him the quotation, an important American economist saying, you've got the most strange Conservative party in the world. A Labor government comes along and encourages the workforce to save 9% of their income and has them agreeing to save 15%, and yet a Conservative government, which ought to at least believe in thrift, comes along and cancels the last 6%. Now that person was Martin Feldstein, the man who just missed out by one place for the chairmanship of the American Federal Reserve System. And this is not, I've come across this many times, that many people abroad say, what's wrong with the Conservatives in Australia? Don't they understand the gift that a Labor government has done? And Feldstein and others have said to me, if we could just get to 1% of wages in America as savings, we reckon we're doing well. But to get to 9%, it would be enormous. Gone in 20 years of age at 15% and retired at 65, with the average earning in a fund around about 60%, they'd go out on 125% of average weekly earnings. As it is now, because they chopped the 15% out, the baby boomers, anyone born in the 1940s, can't now be in the system long enough to get any real capital. And now through Costello, we have missed the great boom from 2003 to 2007 and the great lift in incomes and accumulations in these in pensions and private provisioning. It is impossible now to look after the baby boomers. It's impossible. They can't, there's not enough, and so the reason I was trying to get to 15 early was to front end load it for the baby boom generation, who will be the first big demand upon the budget in the coming years. So that's now lost, gone for all time. What did Costello do? He introduced a set of changes that said if you're above 60, you can take your capital in super free, and if you've got $1 million, you can put it in before 30 June 2007. But for the great body of the workforce, nothing. 9%, too good for you anyway. That's where they are. That's where they are. Costello having made it such a beano for people at the top, the over 60s, to take their money out and spend it. Remember, I had a test in there. If you turned your income into an annuity income, that was a weekly pensionable income, you got a tax benefit. So people bought annuities for the rest of their lives. When he removed that tax benefit and just gave it away, people can now take the money, spend it and line up for the pension. Now, if the 9% isn't enough, and it isn't, and the fashion and habit is to remain on the pension, or mostly on the pension, and the ideal arrives that the lump sum is now just an expendable amount of money to give you a trip abroad or pay the mortgage off, and you just go back to the pension, the whole point of superannuation, of producing an actuarial income, an annuity income in retirement, goes. The rationale for it goes. Costello made it look like just a handful of lollies. You know, the rich get their hands in again, get their money out. It's the lurk merchant's view of the world, rather than the view of universality, of universal superannuation for the great body of working men and women. Go to an anti-destitution model. With all this massive quantity of retired age people living off the back of the public pension, and the intergenerational consequences of a massive retired age community living off the back of a relatively smaller working community. Now, you know, the bits and pieces are there in place to do it, but Howard, in his willfulness, and Costello, in his dumbness, decided to go ahead with it. And now the Labor Party, with our myopic view of it, are doing the same. So we're at the point now where, of course, Costello's proposing himself again, or thinking of proposing himself again, as leader of the Liberal Party. What I ask anyone to do is ask themselves this: what single structural thing did he ever do? And don't say the GST, because Howard did that. That was a 70s relic. What single structural thing did he ever do, other than sit there throwing out the money in the tax cuts, pumping up demand while the central bank was forced to raise interest rates to pump it down? And yet, so bereft is the Liberal Party of talent, they're even thinking about having that clodhopper back. I used to call him the caucus. My nickname for him was Thallium, a slow-acting dope. Thallium, a slow-acting dope, and he is a slow-acting dope. And if our people should be kicking him to pieces right now, but the idea that here's Malcolm Turnbull today talking about what a terrible thing the government's talking about inflation. What's he reckon a 4% inflation rate is? Where do you think that came from? You know, it came from a country with a terms of trade shock, with a government which had been throwing money around like a man with no arms for years and years and years, and a central bank trying to keep domestic activity under control. So, you know, the only thing about Malcolm, unfortunately, I had to make him rich along with the rest of them with my changes. But again, there's no justice in public life.